Social change is a process. Radical social change becomes possible when ordinary people mobilize to challenge unjust systems of authority.
I think you're right, but I think that social change is also much more on the micro level as well, that social change happens at a number of different levels in society.
For me, I think social change it's just that self-explanatory change in society, trying to see and uncover what, let's say, the rest of society don't normally get to see or understand. We go for social change. You go the extra length to get the ordinary, but in an extraordinary manner.
I mean, there's no specific definition of social change. It's change in society. But I think the first comments focused a lot on agency, what people do to bring about change, which is important. But there are all sorts of other things happening which affect the things that people do and affect the way in which we live our lives. How many children do we have? All sorts of demographic things that change over time. How big is the population? How does that relate to the environment? How does, for instance, a reduction of wages affect people, whether they go on strike or not? So I think there's all those kind of aspects to social change as well.
I agree that social change is not restricted only to a macro level. I agree with you that it can be radical, that large structures can interact to change their environment, but also it can happen at a micro level as well. And this is really people, as you said, as agents, social actors, who are continuously engaging with their environment to shape them in any way that they choose to.
Yeah, I think we must distinguish between small, piecemeal reforms and large, radical changes. And I think that social scientists tend to focus on the latter. But I think to understand the big changes, one must have a sense of the small, daily, incremental changes too.
Just to sort of add to what Trevor's saying, I think at the core of social change, it is that ability within groups and people that sort of starts the movement at the micro level, instead of the ones that sort of sociologists sort of romanticize when it's the big movement that's, that's changing structures in society, changing policy. But, I think we also have to take into account that the small movements, the first seeds of social change that are planted within communities when people just interact in daily routines.
Yeah, there's this view that society is like a well-functioning organism where everything is in its own place and everything functions nicely, and I think it's not really true. Like, there's always conflicts and contested issues in society, and social change is in part also about being aware of what these issues are and what our position is in each of these conflicts. And
I think also social change is something that isn't just, it's always continuous. So it's not like 1994 what you call social change. Like, it's a process that always continues. So every year, every month, there's always something changing amongst the people. So I think it's important not to look at it as just happening once, but it's always continuously happening.
To follow on from that would be that old adage that change is the only constant, and the same is certainly true with social change. I think that's something that's always with us. The question for me that social changes need to answer is how does society begin to take control, or how do ordinary people start to take control of what kind of change happens in society?
That's exactly what it is, to try and find ways to change what is wrong in society, and I think that's where this unit comes, sort of has a potential role to play. It's like, with the work that we do, we look at, like Trevor said, we look at the small sort of examples of social change that are going on, and the point is try and get that information out to more people, and to start, through that, to start a conversation about how to actually get social change going.
I think it's not only structural as well, it is, as Claire said, behavioral. I would consider for example, the Black consciousness in the 1960s as social change, the way people view themselves and the sense of agency in actually changing their lives. That is, I suppose, a catalyst of social change.
I also think we have to look at the cultural aspects of change, as I've tried to do with my research, and how, as Nkasi was saying, how ideas have a huge impact on people, and it's important to start those discussions and see where we need to change things. So I think social change is even broader than the economy and politics.
Yeah, I think for me, social change is about, on the one hand, relationships between people, social relations, and on the other hand, the development of how those relations transform over time. So I think for me, the study of social change opens up questions about, yes, how people's relationships to each other change over time, and also opens up questions about dynamics of power and how they also are contested.
I think Zentli made a very good point earlier on when she was talking about how 1994 obviously was a point of social change within South Africa, but it hasn't been a point of complete social change in South Africa. There are many elements that still remain unchanged in South Africa. The economy, for instance, is a very important example. So I think what is interesting when we think about social change is to also think about the things that have stayed the same and to analyse those as well as the changes.
All the movements that have come before, because in South Africa, that just makes our social change and all future attempts at it, very unique and very different from any social change in any context in the world. So I think, it is like we were saying previously, that it's looking at this as a continuous flow, that it sort of feeds into each other. It's not a staccato process that stops here, this is resolved, onto the next, stop, onto the next, but it's a flowing change within societies.
I'm not sure that social change has a different meaning in South Africa than it does in other places. I mean, I think it's very easy to think about South Africa as an isolated place separate from the rest of the world, but in fact it's part of the rest of the world, and many of the things that you find here you also find in other places. But at the same time, I think South Africa is a dynamic place, and there are reasons why social change feels more salient here than in other places, particularly the recent history of struggle, and as a result, the high level of expectations, and there's a real sense of possibility here, which I think makes questions of social change really relevant and salient in this context.
I agree with you about the importance of comparison, but the advantage of comparative work for me is not simply that it shows up similarities between South Africa and the rest of the world, and that's certainly important. We need to overcome that notion that South Africa is somehow special. But it also highlights the areas in which South Africa is different. Unless you do the comparative work, you can't understand the specific dynamics of what's happening in South Africa. But I wanted to pick up on something that other people were saying, because there's a suggestion, I think, in some of the comments that social change is about small incremental changes. It's what happens to individuals, it's about behaviour and so on. And that's fine. But the big things for us, for people doing history, for instance, is not the small everyday things, it's the big events. Those are the things that change most people's lives. And so for me, the focus on events is critical, not only in understanding how society as a whole moves through, 1948, 1994, I think maybe even Marikana now, but also the ways in which those things highlight changes in the structures is very useful for us analytically. It gives us a way into seeing some of the bigger features of society that affect us all.